Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the recognition of the voting. As a former governor, I'm sort of conflicted here because I am a strong believer in states' rights, and the states have the ability and need the ability to make their own laws according to their local needs and their local situation. On the other hand, I view many of the provisions of this bill as a kind of extension of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And as has been testified, the Congress has involved itself in voting and voting rights on numerous occasions. And really, what we're talking about here is protecting the right to vote. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Mr. Waldman, one is a sort of forward-looking request. You are collecting data. You've reported on all these bills that have been filed around the country. I would appreciate it if you would notify the committee, perhaps on a biweekly basis, as we move into the consideration of this bill, what is happening to those bills that have been introduced around the country. Ranking Member Blunt pointed out that some of them will be enacted and some won't. And I think it would help us in our deliberations to learn exactly which of these bills have gone forward in which states, and that will allow us to sharpen the provisions of the bill. Mr. Waldman, can you do that for us, please?
We certainly can. Indeed, our website already tracks the path of these bills, but we will make it very useful and usable to the committee. But it is also the case that there's a very fierce push to enact these bills happening in plain sight in front of our eyes, and we ought not, I would suggest, ignore that either.
And I agree with you. And I think if we're talking about enacting a floor to protect the right to vote, then we shouldn't have to wait for states to be infringing on that right. This should be a protective measure. There hasn't been a lot of discussion, and I suppose, Mr. Waldman, you're the guy to ask about this, at least when I've been here at the committee meeting this morning, about gerrymandering. I consider that one of the most serious problems afflicting our democracy, and it happens in both ways. There are Democratic gerrymandered seats, there are Republican gerrymandered seats. The problem is, instead of the voters choosing the politicians choose the voters. Talk to me about the effect of gerrymandering in this country, the extent of it, and what it's doing to our politics.
Thank you, Senator. You are exactly right. Both parties gerrymander when they can, and it is a risk to the representation of voters. It is a risk of partisan abuse. It is a risk of choking off the voices of communities of color that are often the fastest growing communities. This legislation follows what a lot of states have done, what a lot of voters have put in place in a lot of states. It bans partisan gerrymandering. It requires that redistricting be done with standards for representation of communities and other fair standards. It includes commissions, nonpartisan commissions, to implement this. But even if this legislation is not passed in time to implement those, it has very, very valuable national standards to ensure that all voters are able to have competitive and representative elections.
Well, one of the hidden problems with gerrymandering is if you've got a district that's all Democratic or heavily Democratic or heavily Republican, you tend to have members elected who are on the edges of their two parties. You don't win a primary in one of those by being moderate, and I think that's one of the things that's contributed to the polarization that we see in the Congress. Have you observed that?
Yes, sir, that does seem to be the case, and of course in legislatures as well. And the rules in this bill don't just affect right now, as we know, because redistricting happens every 10 years, and it's going to begin in a few months around the country. If there are abusive redistricting practices and unfair maps that are drawn, those can lock in, a bad system can lock in advantage for much of a decade. And it really does make it something where voters don't want to vote if they don't have a real opportunity to be heard.
And unfortunately, the Supreme Court punted on that issue when I think they had a good case before them that they could have handled and I think abdicated a constitutional responsibility. That's another question. I want to thank all the witnesses today. I just want to close with a little piece about Maine. We have same-day registration, no excuse absentee voting, no voter ID, and no fraud. And I just wonder about all of these provisions that are being enacted all over the country to chase a fraud allegations that I have not yet seen validated in any objective forum. So, Madam Chair, I appreciate the hearing, Ranking Member Blunt, and look forward to consideration of the bill.